You won't find George Murphy or Ronald Reagan or Bob Wilson among those cheerless and timid souls who run down their country. And that brings me to my target for tonight, the professional pessimist. Now, I speak of a man whose theme song is "Every Silver Lining Has a Cloud." In the past, he's been called the prophet of gloom and doom, the troubadour of trouble, the disciple of despair. The professional pessimist has always been with us, and on the great movements of American history, he's always been wrong. Today, he's out of office and out of sorts. You can find him poring over newspapers with a magnifying glass, eagerly seeking out any evidence to prove his point that America is on her way to perdition. To this man, bad news is good news. A couple of years ago, he was sitting pretty. He could point to a steadily climbing rise in the cost of living. He could point to high casualties in a war that had no end in sight. He could point to an ever-increasing rate of crime. He could point to a government that had lost the confidence of its people. But, ladies and gentlemen, the heyday of the professional pessimist is past. More and more, he's finding it harder to make his case that the United States of America is on its last legs. Of course, he's in there trying. When wholesale prices drop, he's quick to say it's too soon to establish a firm trend. When the rate of inflation can be shown to be cut in half, he says it's still too high. And when he sees the rate of crimes increase dropping for the first time in 5 years, he can always find a particularly lurid crime to show society's decay. When he sees defense plants humming with activity, he denounces the military-industrial complex. And when he sees the defense plants close down as war comes to an end, he blames the peacemakers for a rise in unemployment. He likes it both ways. In the United States today, we have more than our share of the Nattering Nabobs of negativism. Actually, they've formed their own 4-H club, the hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history. We have the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee condemning America as a sick society. If we were to believe men like these, we would buy the notion that the United States is headed for recession, repression, and regression. Of course, we are not. That dreaded doomsday machine is only that senator's mimeograph machine. Now, the professional pessimists are very wrong about America. It's really time to stop tearing America down, to stop the hand-wringing and the head-shaking. It's time to reaffirm the values that make this nation the hope of the world. I have a practical reason for saying this. If critics repeat often enough that a society is sick, then some easily frightened members of that society, even though it's healthy, are going to get a little green around the gills. And then others observing these are going to wonder whether they're sick too. Men in positions of power who keep bewailing our outcast state could cause the condition that they profess to see. Now, let me be specific. Early in our administration, we had to combat something called the inflation psychology. Business and labor leaders alike thought that the merry-go-round was going to keep spinning faster and faster, and the very fact of that expectation helped fuel an inflation that drove people with fixed incomes right up the wall. We had to convince everyone that government was at long last ready and willing to make a few painful decisions in order to get the cost of living under control. Because government has talked big before and then backed down when the hard decisions were required, many businessmen took a wait-and-see attitude. That certainly was understandable. They waited and they saw. And what they saw was an administration with the courage to cool down an overheated economy despite the slowing pains that were an unavoidable part of the cure. The inflation psychology shifted. People slowed their borrowing in expectation of ever-increasing rates of interest. Labor's demands were no longer required to figure in a spiral rate of inflation, this shift of psychology, the very shift in thinking in itself, was a significant contribution in the battle against the ever-rising cost of living. But it was important that we not replace the inflation psychology with something just as bad, a recession psychology. If that had happened, this nation could have talked itself into too great an economic slowdown. So we had to combat that recession psychology as well. And we had to do it quickly because we were determined that this was going to be the first inflation in our history that would be cured without a recession. But here, against public interest, typically enters the professional pessimist. You can hear his voice in the mouth of the Democratic National Chairman, direly predicting economic ruin for millions. When 6 economic indicators turn upward, he calls out the 1 or 2 that are still lagging behind and says the sky is still falling. And this is the case with a few red-faced economists who stake their reputation on the need for price controls, ignoring the rationing, the black markets, and the strangulation of free enterprise that inevitably follows such price controls. I'll tell you how I feel about price controls. The best way to control prices is to put responsible men in control of Congress. Yes, and you'll remember that on the floor of the Senate, there arose one of the professional pessimists to do his bit to prevent prosperity. I quote the senator. He said, "The total economic picture will darken still further. I fear that there is no light at the end of this tunnel." Well, you can imagine the disappointment on the faces of the professional pessimists when the unemployment rate, even amid a firm anti-inflation campaign, failed to rise to the levels chronic in the allegedly halcyon years of Kennedy Johnson, or when food prices in the supermarkets slow their rise, or when industrial production and housing starts show significant gains. These men are hard up for hard times. And when a sound prosperity appears on the horizon, they're devastated. They can only make hay when the sun does not shine. Of course, their moves are absolutely predictable. Soon they'll realize that an economic upturn can no longer be doubted. So do you suppose they'll admit they were wrong? Not on your life. They'll take a new tack entirely. What they'll say then is that we're in the midst of another inflationary boom and that we've lost the battle against higher prices. They'll drop the recession talk and try to heat up the inflation talk once again. To them, it really doesn't matter what kind of bad news they predict, just so long as the news is consistently bad. Now let's take another example in an entirely different field. A year ago last summer, in the midst of debate about the ABM, the charge you kept hearing on television and seeing in the headlines was this, that ABM would doom the SALT talks and ruin the chances for arms control. Well, now we have an ABM. And largely because we do, the SALT talks have been moving forward. Do you hear any of the doomsayers standing up and saying, well, I guess I was proven wrong about that? Hardly. Instead, they're now saying that MERV will doom the SALT talks. And when the time comes when the SALT talks show some specific progress toward arms control, do you suppose that you're going to hear one little cheer from the professional pessimists? Not a chance. They'll say with a very straight face that as long as one bow and arrow exists in this world, we will have failed. On the subject of national security, let's look at what the professional pessimists had to say about our policy of Vietnamization. The assistant majority leader of the Senate had this to say just 1 year ago. He said, the war in Vietnam is virtually unchanged. We have made only token troop withdrawals on the battlefield, more an exercise in politics and improvisation, while the level of fighting and casualties continue. Now, ladies and gentlemen, by next month, we will have brought home 165,000 troops, and another 100,000 will be home by mid-April of next year. At the same time, and I can say this from personal observation, recent personal observation, the forces of freedom in South Vietnam are stronger than they've ever been. Our casualties since the Cambodian action have been lower at any time in 4 years than at any time in 4 years. And Vietnamization, to the anguish of the prophets of doom, is not only working, it's working well. Do you hear them admitting that they were wrong, that their policy of pull out and run would have been a disastrous mistake? To quote George Bernard Shaw's Fair Lady, not bloody likely. Do you see them publicly gratified when our casualties drop to 4-year lows? Do you see them pleased at reports from the correspondents on the scene that villages and hamlets are no longer havens for terrorists? Hardly. To them, nothing fails like success. Now, this refusal to admit that America is on the right path colors everything the professional pessimists say and do. To our allies, they propose a policy of the double cross. Before our enemies, they preen in blatant obsequiousness. The men who smack their lips over any American setback in the world are also great prognosticators here at home. You remember not long ago how the decade of the 70s was supposed to become one long hot summer, how all our cities were supposed to be racked by guerrilla war, and riots were to become the disorder of the day. Of course, there have been tragic incidents in our cities in the past couple of years, and we've seen policemen and even judges become targets for terror. But those who predicted a rising pattern of citywide violence have been happily proven wrong. This is no reason for complacency. The combination of effective police work and responsive community relations must continue to avert riot situations before they boil over. But the very same people who were saying that all our cities would become permanent battlegrounds 2 years ago, and were wrong, are now saying that our college campuses will become permanent battlegrounds today. Time and patience and firmness and understanding and the kind of perceptive analysis and the kind of courage and forthright candor exhibited by your governor will prove that they're wrong again. The professional pessimists have been wrong about inflation, they've been wrong about recession, wrong about Vietnamization, wrong about disorder, wrong about arms control, wrong about crime, wrong about the strength of the American character. And some of these wrongos have the colossal gall to ask you to elect them again. I think that the men who sold America short will not be around for long. I think that the American voters this year are going to throw out the throwbacks to isolationism and will affirm their faith in the affirmative men, the men who believe in the American dream, the men who are confident that we can rise to our challenges, and the men who have faith in the American people. Thomas Jefferson had to cope with the professional pessimists of his time, just as we do today, and this is what he said. Jefferson said that his theory had always been that if we are to dream, the flatteries of hope are just as cheap and much pleasanter than the gloom of despair. The flatteries of hope he felt for this nation turned out to be right, and the gloom of despair felt by others turned out to be wrong. So let's heed that lesson and turn away from those who would tear down what generations of hard-working idealists have built. Let us turn toward men like the candidates here tonight, men like George Murphy and Ron Reagan and Bob Wilson, men who reject the self-defeating philosophy that ours is a sick society. They believe, as the President does and as I do, that ours is the healthiest and most progressive society the world has ever known, and we're committed to making it better in the years to come.